Hello and welcome to Excavations, and we are in the second section of our part 2 of the Accursed share. For those of you in the Zone translation, that is on page 45. This is Historical Data 1, Society of Consumption, where Bataille decides that he trusts Spanish accounts of Aztec sacrifice and can draw general theories from it, because that's a thing you can do. And one of the things that I can say is, like, he's not, to be fair to Bataille, he is not making this up whole cloth. But he is trusting the Spanish sources on Mexica culture, like, entirely. And then extrapolating general meaning from it without, what we do today, which was contrast that with other indigenous sources like the Tlaxcaltecs and some of the other Nahua speaking groups in the region, and compare that to what we know from archaeology. And while there are some people who have tried to cast doubt that the Mexica did human sacrifice or engaged in cannibalism, it's pretty much 100% been confirmed that they did, and they did. But as to their meaning or specific, notions of the ritual and the specific rituals that he cites here, that's a little bit more iffy because, again, he's trusting post-Hispanic conquest sources on this. And, I mean, to be fair, like, a lot of the best books on the Mexica and the Aztecs have only started coming out in the last 10 years. So I guess it's hard to hold Bataille accountable for that. But when you're doing a general, I also like his historical data is, two things. It's the potlatch and it's Aztec sacrifice culture. And then we move on to a different set of historical data. And I'm like, in what world can you draw a general theory from two case studies?
It's similar to the first section where in 40 pages, Bataille tries to do more than all of Capital, all 3 volumes.
Yeah, and Capital does in 4,000 pages or whatever.
Yeah.
All right. So, we also know from reading Bataille's biography, and if you haven't, oh my God, is it fucking weird? Go read it. That he was obsessed with human sacrifice, started societies around it. This was like, he wanted to die by human sacrifice. I don't know. If I was his wife, I'd run off with Lacan too. It's one of the few times where I think Lacan would be a better choice. But this is enough shit talking a dead Frenchman. So let's get into the actual substance of the sections here. And we're going to at least aim to get through the sacrifice and wars of the Aztec, and then maybe a little bit we might get into the potlatch section. But yeah. Okay. So I just want to start us off with the discussion. I'm going to do the thing I always do because I'm a textualist and I do textualist shit. And I'm going to read a paragraph and then we'll go from there. I want to state a principle from the outset. By definition, this movement, the effect of which is prodigality, is far from being equal to itself. Okay, already we're dealing with such an abstract reification within the first sentence of the book that I'm like, okay. While there is an excess of resources over needs, meaning real needs, such as society would suffer if they were not satisfied, this excess is not always consumed to no purpose. Society can grow, in which case the excess is deliberately reserved for growth. Growth regularizes, it channels a disorderly effervescence into a regularity of productive operations. But growth, to which is tied to development of knowledge, okay, that's another interesting supposition there, is by nature a transitory state. It cannot continue indefinitely. I mean, everybody makes that point. Man's science obviously has, except for Marx sometimes, Man science obviously has to correct the perspectives that result from historical conditions of its elaboration. Nothing is more different from man enslaved to the operations of growth than relatively free man of stable societies. The character of human life changes the moment it ceases to be guided by fantasy and begins to meet the demands of understanding that ensure the proliferation of given works. In the same way, the face of man changes if he undergoes from the turbulence of night to serious business of the morning. The serious humanity of growth becomes civilized, the more gentle, but it tends to confuse gentleness with the value of life, and life's tranquil duration with its poetic dynamism. God damn the French and Bergson. Fucking, ugh. I think I think Bergson and wine ruined the thinking of an entire country. I'm gonna piss off my French listeners, all 5 of them. All right. Under these conditions, the clear knowledge that generally has things cannot become a full self-knowledge. It is misled by what it takes for full humanity, that is humanity at work, living in order to work without ever fully enjoying the fruits of its labor. Of course, the man who is relatively idle or at least unconcerned with the achievements, the type discussed in both ethnography and history, is not the consummate man either, but helps us gauge that which we lack. So in that last sentence, we see, let us call him the Derridian sense, the specter of Marx, about modes of production, but also this is so general and so abstract before he gets to the Aztec Mexica culture that I'm. Do we think that even can be wrong? I mean, like, I was reading this, I'm like, is this even possible to be wrong? I'm not even sure. Like, I don't know that it's that meaningful. Discuss.
Well, just off the bat, reading that first paragraph, little things were like taking off in my head. I was like, oh, there's like Hegel there, there's Marx there, and then like it started. I kept moving forward, and I was like, wait, there's Heidegger there. It kind of felt like everything was where at any point in time you could read a sentence and be like, oh yeah, like Bataille is clearly like referencing Hegel at this point, or Bataille is clearly referencing Marx at the end. To a point where I got to the end of this paragraph and I was like, I think I'm either completely out of my depth or he didn't say anything. But I actually don't know the answer to that question.
My suspicion might be both, because I do feel like I do feel like there's Nietzsche, there might be Heidegger. I'm not sure. See, when was this written originally? '67. So yeah, there's gonna definitely be influences of Heidegger by that time. But I mean, this starts. Bataille is like a precursor of the trend that you see after Kojève, where you just like squish Hegel and Heidegger together and pretend that makes sense, even though they're kind of opposed thinkers.
Bataille at least probably wouldn't care if it makes sense.
Yeah, to be fair to Bataille.
If you told him, well, you have to systematize this, he'd be like, no, I'm explicitly like not trying to do that.
Well, this one's weird because
it's systematized, but it's also kind of not. Yeah,
right. It wants to have its like it doesn't want to go full Nietzsche and be like, we can't systematize anything. In fact, I'm going to do aphorisms and contradict myself later on. Ha ha. But it's also not systematizing in a way where you can pin down exactly even what it's saying.
It's like semi-formalized, but not systematic.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way of.
Yeah. I think with this, because this part, I always like it when he does this like weird, like, I'm making an argument, but no, I'm just gonna like throw in some poetry about like man's nature to night and day for no. Like, you're like, what is this about? I was thinking that I think in a way, if there is like sort of a core argument, I feel like this is like his preface is he's basically trying to say like, why am I bringing up these old different types of societies? As he's trying to just be like, modern man has like this productive thing, and our civilization is focused on this idea that like the good of life is inherently tied to our idea of like formalizing things into like a productive pattern. But like these cultures seem so alien to us that they force us to reflect on like maybe that's not it's like the basic kind of like semi orientalist type like Western anthropological thing of being like, but if we look at these other societies, they're so different that they shatter our notions of what we assume to be true. Kind of, I think that's kind of all that he's really getting at, but he's just saying it in his weird way. And it's also, I think it's also very clearly kind of a mirror to, we'll see at the end of the bit on Potlatch, where he starts being like, the communist and the rebel in our society is the person that doesn't work, who's lazy. And I think he's kind of setting up that sort of mirror where he's like, where he has this thing about like the type that is the like, you know, the idle man, the one unconcerned for achievements, that this was what people were like in other societies. And so we need to see them to realize what we're doing. And then he'll return to that later and be like, but the rebels and today in the civilized world are these idle men, or like kind of thing.
But in this formalization, I do want to add this because I think this is where he kind of inverts Hegel. But growth, which is tied to development of knowledge, is by nature a transitory state. It cannot continue indefinitely. Man's science, obviously, to correct the perspectives that result from the historical condition of its elaborations, nothing more different than the enslaved to the operations of growth than the relatively free man of stable societies. So what he's also saying is like, this is a pattern that once you've achieved like a certain amount of surplus and growth, that you can't really do that anymore. You have to do something with the excess or the surplus somehow, right? And so I agree everything. I think PH is right about everything that he just said, but I also think he's trying to make a universal argument still, even though he's not trying to do it in a systematic way.
Yeah, there's a generalization. It's the general economy, like
right. And if you wonder where that comes from, that's Marcel Mauss. Like, that's why this reminds me of Graeber, but also like that point that growth can't continue indefinitely. You can see it in the degrowth socialist. You can see it in Heidegger. You can see it in Dugan. You can see it in almost any ecological thinker ever. I mean, there is a way in which this rhymes with, you know, my big obsession with Joseph Tainter and complexity stuff, because complexity is actually related directly to surplus, and the accumulation of surpluses over time. So
well, we brought up complexity in the first chapter too. I think PH kind of went into like how, again, it's like an unsystematized complexity theory, where if you were to walk up to somebody who was like working on complexity and give them Bataille, they'd be like, I'm not actually quite sure how to do what you're doing here. But Bataille is also kind of working in that general frame,
right?
Abstracted frame.
I feel like, to use the term of the use, that if you gave this to a complexity scientist, they go, well, this has the same vibe as us, but I have no idea how you got there.
Yeah.
Right. So then we immediately shift to consumption in the Aztec worldview, which I find funny, just as a side note, as a person who is absolutely obsessed with Mesoamerican anthropology and culture. Like, it's something that I have been obsessed with like most of my life. And I find it fascinating because all the narratives around how the Mexica lost are really interesting if you really break them down, because it's not really the Spanish who beat them. Although if there is a thing that causes the Spanish to beat them, it's the fact that they use steel weapons versus obsidian swords that are not designed to kill most of the time. But it's, you know, the way that it was taught to me in like grade school is like, oh, the Spanish had gunpowder and had more technology. And actually you discover like, no, the Mexica were actually technologically just as advanced as the Spanish. It's just that Mexica warfare is was fundamentally different things. And like Bataille kind of almost gets there. But again, he trusts the Spanish sources. Like, all of his sources are clearly Spanish sources for this stuff.
Which the main one that he uses is that the Bernardino de Sahagún, the monk guy.
Yeah.
Which I remember, I did some like really basic research trying to look up some of this, and my understanding is, at least to Bataille's credit, regardless of whether he knew this or not, my understanding is that guy is considered probably the best of the Spanish sources.
Yeah, they don't think he's lying.
Because
Like,
he apparently was really frustrated that the other like Spanish like religious people who were doing interviews and stuff with the indigenous, he was frustrated that he thought that they were like intentionally misrepresenting stuff to then like help their Catholic faith. And he was like, no, we have to like actually understand what their like religious beliefs are, even though it's for the purpose of like conversion and stuff. Which,
yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that there's still plenty of stuff that he got wrong because he's just like a guy taking down accounts and thinking that he's like trying. But at least to his credit, my understanding is that that guy of the Spanish sources is considered probably the most like rigorous in an attempt to, he wanted to try and actually get things like fairly accurate. But it is also just like one source.
Yeah, from what I understand, like the story of like the sun and the moon and everything is like generally correct. I mean, with how like religion and mythology at that point like worked is like there of course are going to be different stories based on different regions and like things like that. But generally, this creation story of the sun and the moon is accurate to a certain extent.
Right. One of the things I'm fascinated about with the Mexica that actually maybe does need to be discussed in terms of this book, though, is that, and if for those of you wondering why I keep saying that, is because the Aztec is a specific group of the Mexica, and is that they weren't actually in Teotihuacan for a super long time. Like, by the time we get to Montezuma, you are dealing with a culture that had literally erased its own records about where it came from, and was actually an outside, viewed by other indigenous groups as an outside invader, and viewed by their own mythology as not originally from there. And if you look at if you trace the Nawa influence on indigenous languages, its linguistic similarities are closer to Ute and Paiute and Dine than it is to like Mayan or Quechua or any of that. And so it does seem interesting that when you're talking about this as a growth society, but it's also a society that had only been ruling the area for about 200 years. Which I mean, again, that's still a pretty long time. I mean, you think about it, like that's like you know, the United States in the 70s, and we you know, we're not but it compared to like this idea that it was a super growth culture, and that growth had stagnated already as if it's a long-standing culture is actually historically wrong. But you wouldn't know that from the sources that he was using because they didn't know that. That's something that we know from like translating stuff from Mexica languages now. That's not something that they had access to in the monk accounts. Although there's some hints at it. But yeah, so for example, the records of the Mexica prior to like 100 years before the Spanish arrived had already been destroyed by the Mexica themselves. So it complicates the generalization, which is the only reason why I bring it up. But I will say, like, yeah, I think if you're gonna use a European source from that's contemporaneous, he chose the least shitty. And it was probably pretty cutting. He was to give him credit, he was probably basing this on fairly cutting edge scholarship at the time. This after the 60s, there was this period of revision around Mexica stuff where they tried to argue that there was never any human sacrifices at all.
Yeah,
and that was all made up
about that. Yeah.
And that was in the 70s and early 80s. And no, we got hard evidence. Like there's plenty of evidence, even in folk culture, but there's also there's just archaeological evidence of mass graves. Like both of the Teotihuacanos and of the Mexica. And the Teotihuacanos are a group of people we don't know shit about, because while the Teotihuacan in Mexico City was built by the Mexica, Teotihuacan was not. It was built by the Teotihuacanos, and we know that when the Mexica resettled those pyramids and added to them, there was no one there, but they were also a sacrifice culture. So anyway, that is Varn's anthropological corner, and I never ever get to talk about the Mexica on the show, so it's fun to do. Go ahead.
For the next section, should we do a close reading, or should we just summarize, because it's mostly just like him?
Yeah, we should just summarize it. It's mostly facts, right? Let's summarize it. Who wants to summarize it for us? The quick consumption in the Aztec worldview. Blah blah. The Aztecs, of whom I will speak about first, are poles apart from us morally. I mean, okay, like.
As someone who spoke to an Aztec, I can say there.
No. I think we can summarize what he's trying to get to. They were just as concerned about sacrificing as they were about working.
Yeah, and he basically bases this on that what the evidence he takes of like their cosmological worldview is that the use of human sacrifice is to like give to the sun, which is like this ever burning god, and that the sun, like Bataille is obsessed with the ideas like the sun is like the primal source of like excessive energy. Like the sun is always just like giving out energy, and he sees like the Aztec worldview is like tuned to this basic fact, and they think like we need to do human sacrifice to make sure that the energy of the sun like continues.
Yep. And I mean, he gives like several page-long quotes from De Sagun. I mean, I was interested. He doesn't even try to summarize these. He just like does a long quote of someone else's
he does
summary.
Like 3-page quote.
And then the priest killed their victims on top of pyramids. I just want to say sometimes. But anyway,
yeah, that was another thing I read, is that like because the Aztec manuscripts, there's like the ones that are like before and after.
Mm-hmm.
It's like with Spaniards, and all the like images of like them being on top of like the clearly drawn pyramids with like blood flowing in big crowds. That's all post-Spaniard manuscripts that are drawn with converted native peoples talking to them. Versus the ones that are shown before, there's usually no clear background indication of where the sacrifice is happening. It's just kind of like someone on an altar and someone there doing it. You don't see crowds. You don't see like a lot of clear imagery about so we don't know if it was like actually that often a big public thing. It could have been a very private, like specific religious thing.
Yeah, the
later ones are like the popularly shown like type.
Right. I mean, like, we do know that some of the altars are on top of pyramids, but they weren't all on top of pyramids. And we also know of multiple forms of sacrifice, such as cenote sacrifice, where you drown people in a big, deep well in the hole in the middle of although that tended to be in Nawa Mayan hybrid culture, which is also confusing because the Quiche Maya don't seem to have started with human sacrifice, but adopted it later. And it's also unclear where it comes from, if it comes from the Mexica or if that comes from like the Teotihuacanos, because we know the we have hard evidence that the Teotihuacanos did mass sacrifices, because Teotihuacan's built on like massive graves of people who were clearly. I mean, the other thing that, I mean, one of the other weird things that I started reading about, because if you get into like the once they got over the denial of the was how much cannibalism was involved, and some people actually have posited that this was about a protein deficiency, which I think is a little bit too easy. But
there was that book by that guy that claimed like any evidence in the world is probably wrong. Like,
right. Including racks of skulls and signs of butchery on bones that was made up by the Europeans somehow. So yeah, that guy, I forgot the guy in the 80s, but he basically no one takes that seriously anymore, but it was actually it was
widespread
in the 70s as a belief thing.
I saw it looked like basically the conclusion is everyone was like, yeah, it's good that this guy spurned debate and made people like reevaluate certain like assumptions in their evidence, but like you can't empirically claim that there's no culture that has ever like engaged in human consumption as like a cultural not as just like pure survival, but like as a cultural thing. Like there's evidence that it happens.
Yeah, because this guy didn't just do it for the Mexica. He claimed that it was all
like worldwide. It's all just,
no evidence. Do we have genetic evidence of cannibalism?
Graeber definitely cited this person at one point in one of his early works.
Who did?
Graeber definitely did.
Yes. Graeber said a lot of stupid shit in a lot of different times.
That's fair.
And I have some fans that get really mad at me when I misrepresent Graeber by quoting early him versus later him, and I don't think Graeber's consistent, but yes, Graeber did a lot of that. Graeber also, as I will reiterate, doesn't believe in biology. So
speaking, you've got to separate the Hegelian Graeber versus the scientific Graeber.
What scientific Graeber?
Stupid things. So we have in the section where he's talking about like the important in human sacrifices of Mexico, page 49. So we just got to the part where he's saying like, oh, they do these like sacrifices on pyramids. And this has one of the most insane lines that I was like, there's no way you could justify like I'm like, maybe you're onto something interesting here, but there's no way you can like empirically clarify this, where he just says, for them, wars meant consumption and not conquest. And I was like, what does that mean, Bataille? I don't know that you can actually like say that that's like as distinct here. Even if you're saying that like religiously they want to like appease the sun, like it's like you can't imagine that their society had an ideological justification also for conquest. Like,
yeah, that was insane to me, because like the reason why the Spaniards were able to get like the Titlac was that they were conquested.
I feel like the only way you could justify that is if there was no land ever taken and no peoples ever subjugated, and it was just like go to war, come back, go to war, and that's just like clearly not the case.
Well, that's why I brought up that whole thing. The Mexica are not even from Central Mexico. They are most likely from northern Mexico, southern United States, southwestern United States originally. Even linguistically, their language is closer to southwestern indigenous groups. So it's just, and they may have been the people who ate the Anasazi. That's one not been completely debunked, the anthropological theory, because there's signs that someone who wiped out the Anasazi were doing cannibalism, and we don't know who they were. And it's about the timing works. But again, what do we really know about the Mexica? Not a ton, because they also destroyed their own history. So, I mean, we basically have 150 years in the chronicles. So like, but yeah, that's insane, because clearly they were conquesting different tribes. That's part yes. What I think is, I think what he could be getting at that's kind of true is that Mexica weaponry was not designed in general to always kill. It was designed to maim, so you could take people back to be sacrificed.
Yeah. Well, because the next portion is he does another long thing of block quotes about like how they would prepare like a person, and like even though they were to be sacrificed, you treated them well and you did all this ritual stuff, and they were supposed to be like happy and fat and things and whatnot. So yeah, I think that like that's kind of what he's trying to get at, but it's like I think it's too easy to like act as if like I think that he's trying to kind of make this claim of like, well, yeah, they knew that they had to like go to war and maintain like slaves and do all this stuff, but I think his thing is he's like, but all of this is motivated by their fear of the sun going out, and then it's one of those things where he kind of conveniently like even though he wants to be all materialist, he kind of like conveniently like just buries any like material concerns of the Aztecs and maintaining an empire to just like religious motivation in a way that I'm like, that's not like obviously true. Like
it's a shockingly like early 2000s new atheist argument almost.
Yeah, they're all just doing stuff because they don't know better, like, and they just have like this religious.
Well, to be fair, I think maybe to Ty's perspective, like the way he talks about that reminds me of his line back on page 6 when he says, like, the serious humanity of growth becomes civilized, more gentle, but it tends to confuse the gentleness with the value of life. So to me, that's sort of like, you know, I think it's almost like a relativistic argument. Like, look, hey, they sacrificed and we work, but who's to say who valued life? We don't really value life any differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bataille always is doing a reversal where like he's not necessarily claiming like they're stupid, because I think that he thinks that their obsession with consumption is probably like
more normal.
I guess he would say that that is a real material like interest, and we just think that it's not. I just think that from an anthropological standpoint, I don't think that you can actually justify that like the motives of the Aztecs are this single-minded, and that there's not an element of just interest in material conquest that's not mostly just about like consumption for the sun in this like religious form.
Right. And also to deal with this religious thing, they weren't the only Mesoamerican society to do human sacrifice. And in fact, they may have learned it for someone else. And there are practical things that you deal with, like I said, that's why I brought up the interpretation, which I do find a little bit crazy, but that like that this was about actually providing a protein source for nobles. That is a theory that has been anthropologically floated around about, you know, kind of the opposite of Bataille, where none of it is it has any religious justification, and it's really about, well, there's not a lot of protein sources that are bigger than turkeys in Mesoamerica, so cannibalism is going to be rampant, which I think is also kind of a ridiculous argument, but because there are other places that don't have large fauna that for people to eat, and we didn't always do mass cannibalism. And also, it's not, the other thing is, it's not clear. It is not clear how mass the cannibalism was. We know that it happened. We know that, like, you guys know the origin story of Pozole, right? Maybe you don't.
Not sure if I'm confusing it with something else.
Pozole, that lovely Christmas soup you get in Mexico that's full of hominy and pork that I don't eat because I can't eat pork at all. But like, the reason why pork is chosen is it's supposed to be human limbs. And that's like an indigenous origin stories for why they substitute the meat that they used to put in it with pork. And I've heard that from like indigenous Mexicans, so it's not just a white person thing. It's just but we don't know how common it was, and the Spanish sources claim some wild shit that like Montezuma would just have babies killed and just serve them to people, and we don't have a ton of evidence for that, but then we might not have a ton of evidence for that, like what would be surviving. It doesn't show up on all the Spanish sources. So, and excuse me if I sometimes pronounce Montezuma's name right and sometimes pronounce it the Spanish way. I'm terrible at Nawa. But I find it really interesting because Bataille, I think where I get this is, even though he might be inverting stuff, I don't think he's trying. This is one of those times where he's trying to invert European values, but in inverting them is actually accepting a lot of European justifications and narratives. And I don't think we completely understand what the Nawa were up to. I mean, I think he does accurately recount what we know about their beliefs about gods and blood, but we don't know that that's why it started. We don't know when their religious system, as it existed around the time of the conquest fully developed. There's a lot we do not know about the Mexica. So I find it really fascinating. I think the intimacy of executioners and victims section is interesting.
Well, that section was fascinating to me because it almost, and correct me, like I might just be like completely off base here. He almost seemed to be like, I'm gonna like insert Marxist terms into this as well, even though Bataille is not doing it. But he almost seems to be making an argument that the relationship with human life is actually less alienated in this kind of like sacrifice society than it is.
He is
like
making that argument.
Okay.
It's not just if he is actually making that argument. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Then I'm not 100% off base here. This is good to know.
Yeah, I think this becomes more clear later on in this same chapter about where he starts like just suddenly stops talking about the Aztecs and he just kind of like waxes philosophical about like death and stuff for a while. I feel like it's like definitely good. This is where he's leading up to just being like, yeah, he has this kind of like Nietzschean inversion of Hegel where he's like, actually, it's not like there's like the master slave dynamic, but it's not about like recognition really in this like abstract form that like resolves the tension. It's that you have to have some kind of like rupture or like sacrifice or like waste that fully unveils like that everything's on the same level and is like,
it's
not
Nietzsche
hierarchical kind of thing. Like
it's like a Girardian Nietzsche. Almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, Bataille kind of is the guy that like brought Nietzsche into like popularity as like this like radical philosopher in France. I mean, he was around, but like Bataille was considered the guy who made the best like case of like an anti-Nazi Nietzsche in like the 20th century.
Bataille and one of Bataille's other circle members, Kolowski. He's a French guy with a Polish name. Those are the two who like made Nietzsche okay to study if you were before Lacerdo made it uncool again. I mean, to be fair, it isn't unique to them because German critical theory had already kind of made Nietzsche safe for that. Because the Frankfurt School was also big into, using Nietzsche. So we can't just say it was totally Bataille. Yeah. But Bataille's where it really kicks off. I think that's
in the specific like French 20th century tradition. He's a very big key. Like whenever you read like Derrida or Deleuze or Foucault, like talking about like Nietzsche and disruption and stuff, they're almost always keying in on a very like Bataille influenced like version.
But their Nietzsche is Bataille and Blanchot and a little bit of who else is was trying to recuperate Nietzsche from that time. I mean, it's also you also get it from the fact that they got so much from Lacan, and Freud is kind of a crypto Nietzschean, and so it's already in Lacan too. But then their Hegel's Kojève's Hegel. It's not Hegel. Like as I went through in the John Rapetti show, which I will it is currently down, but it was coming back. I'm just doing somebody a favor. I talk about like these guys all went to the same Kojève fucking lectures, apparently. Like I didn't even know that, but they were all like in the same lecture hall.
Oh wow.
So like we actually do know where this comes from. It's like Bataille and in the Kojève lectures is where all this stuff that creates the Marxo-Freudian Nietzschean hybrid that's so unique to France.
There's the infamous debate where after a Kojève lecture, Bataille, Merleau-Ponty, and what's the one English like logical positivist guy, Ayers?
Oh,
Ayer.
Yeah. Like they all apparently like met and had a debate about whether the sun exists or not.
Yeah.
like and you can find like letters and stuff about it. Yeah, it's true. Like that's the kind of stuff that when people are like, oh, 20th century French culture was so inspired. I'm like, yeah, like I want to go get drunk after a lecture and debate about the existence of the sun. With a logical empiricist and fucking Merleau-Ponty.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. That's like French culture. Like, I am hesitant about this like idealization of French philosophical culture because I basically think it's like rock star college, like dorm bullshit is what it is. But with like no feathers because apparently the Sorbonne was just letting anyone talk about anything.
Yeah,
as long as you had a degree, just But yeah, like if you also Bataille starts that trend of like digging up history and anthropology, but taking it at totally face value that fucking Foucault does. Like in History of Madness, Foucault just cites his sources as if they're true, which is bizarre to me, given the other elements of Foucault's own philosophy. But like Foucault makes the mistake of like believing literary sources that are made up are real without checking them on archaeology all the time. And it's like apparently a big flaw in the History of Madness, or the short form in English, Madness and Civilization. And that's a long tradition on the left. Although, I mean, I guess one of the open debates is, do we consider Bataille leftist? I don't even fucking know. Like, he definitely kind of wanted to be some kind of Marxist, but he flirted with fascism and he flirted with, I mean, it's hard to know what he didn't flirt with, actually.
I mean, in every sense of the word, is Bataille not just what you would call, I mean, what ended up getting, like, there's a bunch of different things that got lumped into the category of, like, utopian socialism, but wouldn't Bataille fall into, like, one of those categories?
Well, no. Because, like, I mean, maybe, but all the things, he doesn't rhyme with Fortier or Owenism or any of that. Like,
yeah, definitely not Christian.
But he has like
a aspect of it.
I think you mean just that he has a sort of like weirdly like he's like there's this idea that if we wrap our heads around, we can kind of make society operate on this line.
Yeah, maybe like an esoteric socialism is a better word.
Yeah,
for that.
it's like a esoteric like kind of mystical.
I would esoteric utopian socialism with human sacrifice characteristics. Like so it's just like, yeah, and every now and then we just kill someone we like just to do it. Mexicans shed blood only provided that they risk dying. Yeah, there's the religious character of the war section I think is interesting because he's not, from what I know about Mexica anthropology and what we've translated, he's not totally wrong here, but he's taking it on a very surface level. So, I mean, the sacrifice of prisoners cannot be understood apart from the conditions that made them possible. Wars and the assumed risk of death. The Mexicans shed blood only provided that they risked dying. They were conscious of this, I mean, of enchantment of war and sacrifice. Although this makes it sound like there was never murder in Mexica society, which I just do not believe. Like it's just like, oh, so they only killed for that? Like no one ever just murdered some motherfucker because they got in the way? Like I just don't believe that. Like that
I mean, maybe it's more that he's just saying like, well, they had like, you needed to have like a specific kind of death. It's like sort of like the glorified, like when people misunderstand like Viking stuff where they think that every Viking wanted to go die on the battlefield to get to Valhalla, like kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think he's saying something like that where he's like, well, like, sure, people could just die in normal circumstances, but the benefit of like a battle or sacrifice was that it specifically fed the sun.
You know what? Yeah, you know what would be an interesting reception history that I would love to read is not, reading the reception history around Aztecs and Mexica and the reception history around interpretations of the Vikings. And by that, I do not mean what they actually believe, but what we impugn upon their beliefs today. Yeah. I would be fascinated to see how they parallel because you're right, PH. Now that you mentioned that, I'm like, yeah, we do the same shit with the Vikings all the time. We pretended everybody was going to go to Valhalla, and that's why they were all murdering psychopaths, and that they were all murdering psychopaths too. And and no one was gonna, there's no afterlife for people who didn't buy a diamond, which is all just wrong, but it's a common belief set about the.
Or you think that like anyone who didn't intentionally try to buy violently was like considered like, dishonorable or something,
Mhm.
Right.
Like, even though it's like, like Valhalla is considered a great afterlife, but it's not like they expected everyone to try and go to Valhalla. That wasn't like part
it
of
wasn't the
moral,
only even
thing.
positive afterlife, right?
Yeah.
Like the other things about, the other thing is like what I find interesting is we don't focus on on Viking or Norse human sacrifice as much, although we know they did it, including of slave women. But it was also voluntary. But what you discovered that they probably did sounds pretty horrible. So how voluntary really was it? We don't really know. And that part of this is left out too. There's a good book that I would tell people to read about all this stuff called Edible People that talks about like cannibalism, religious sacrifice, and slavery. And
They didn't go with the Twilight Zone How to Serve Man.
No, it's just called Edible. I think it's Edible Persons, maybe even the book. It's a good book though, because it is a response to that book that said that it never happened, and B, it goes into how much it's used in the maintenance of slavery, in specific, and how much it's gendered. And actually, the Mexica are interesting because while they did sacrifice women, they seem much more into sacrificing men. Although, again, we have evidence they sacrifice women and children too. Whereas there are other cultures where like cannibalism and human sacrifice are almost always women or slaves.
Well, maybe this ties into the kind of next section, which is also tied into his like consumption not conquest thing, which is from the primacy of religion to the primacy of military effectiveness.
Yeah,
where he kind of tries to say, he explicitly says like they're not a military society, but like their specific use of sacrifice like ties into them having war in a way that is like very like unique to them in a way, like because he says a military society, this is on page 54, is a venture society for which war means a development of power, an orderly progression of empire. It is a relatively mild society. It makes a custom of the rational principle of enterprise, whose purpose is given in the future, and it excludes the madness of sacrifice. There is nothing more contrary to military organization than these squanderings of wealth represented by hecatombs of slaves. And yet the extreme importance of warfare had brought about a significant change for the Aztecs in the direction of the rationality of their enterprise, which introduces, together with the concern for results and for effective force, a beginning of humanity, as against the cruel violence of consumption.
Yeah.
Can
I just say bullshit? Like,
it's so insane.
Like the idea that most military societies do not waste massive amounts of resources, both in terms of human life and in material production, is nuts to me.
Well, also,
like,
this is he uses the word hecatomb, which goes back to it's a Greek word for a mass sacrifice of oxen for religious purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can get that, like, he's almost pushing a bit back against like the Ernst Jünger ideal of war, right? Where it's like, like war is like kind of like wasteful in this way, but it's perceived as like this sort of like, there's like the heroic sacrifice of like the faceless masses of soldiers, but like the idea is that the society itself is like rationalized and industrialized and very like orderly.
Yeah.
So I think that's what he's.
To push back on the idea, like, European history, that war made the state type thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is,
But
well, I don't know that it's true, but I think that he's reacting to maybe a certain kind of like European view.
Yeah, this sounds like like the rational war of contrast seems like liberal warfare, like expansionist settler warfare that we think about in the Americas, when the Europeans came to the Americas, and and then wars of empire. But one of the things that I like to point out, just as a Marxist, is like we always talk about wars as one of the ways to fix the problem of overproduction, because it blows shit up unnecessarily and is very fucking costly. And unless you can expand markets, war is a net loss. And the only reasons it's not a net loss from a Marxist perspective is when you can increase variable capital by including new human subjects into your but there's a limit to that. And so I don't know.
Or if you're someone that can produce for a war that you're not like particularly active in, that can be beneficial for your country. Yeah. But
if you're the United States after a war, so you get to rebuild everything. Yeah, it's great. But
even World War I was a huge boon to like the U.S. position in the world system and everything like that too, not just World War II.
Right, but then we see when that stagnates, like because wars after World War II, people like, oh, wars make the economy better, and like, but they don't though. Like they did in like these specific instances where the U.S. loses very little of its own productive capacity, can throw a bunch of excess stuff out, but doesn't lose we don't get bombed. So we don't lose any of the wealth destruction. And that's so specific historically and so weird that that's not like a normal pattern of how warfare goes. And if you look at like prior notions of war, what you're doing is increasing variable capital and increasing land holdings, which would make sense. But it comes at a cost. And that cost is like, you got to maintain a warrior caste, motherfucker. And that's like your entire society has to be like geared towards that. So,
and to be clear, from what I understand, the Mexica were in fact taking land as well in these conquests.
Oh, they definitely were taking land.
Like it's like
again, they weren't even I know it's uncouth to talk about non-European settler colonialism, but it is they're even by the modern definition a settler colonial society if you take their own history to be true, because they also say that they were not originally from Central America.
I think one thing when I read this is I'm like, I keep wondering, like, so is Bataille, like, would Bataille say that like ancient Rome is a military society but not, or would he also be like, oh, but they had like bread and circuses and orgies and bag sacrifices, so they are also like this? Like, I don't know, like, what is the counterpoint?
He seems to have it both ways.
Society, or like,
because there's Rome stuff in his stuff and his sex and death books, like so like eroticism and that kind of stuff. Yeah,
like that's the thing is I'm like, is he just trying to make a counter argument at this point to like what he sees as like modern rationalized industrial military society, or when he's talking about like military societies, is he saying like medieval like France is a military society or something? Like, I don't really know. And like obviously I don't know enough about how the Aztec like empires managed their military forces and things, but like, and I think that maybe he does have a good kind of kernel of insight about like, obviously they did care a lot about sacrifice for religious purposes, and it may not be entirely wrong to point out that given how short a time they existed, whether he knew that or not, like looking at how they expanded and took over and had to develop probably some kind of like administrative or land holding apparatus with wars and things, there probably is something you could say to like, if we had the right sources, the way they use and operate human sacrifice probably does have a big change that might look like a kind of like rationalization or like standardization and stuff, like, you know, an industrialization of sacrifice in a certain way. Like, I think that maybe that is like a thing that we probably just don't have enough sources to really know it. Sometimes you hear that kind of thing about like the Aztecs died because they just like killed too many of their own people to like do anything. I think that's probably bullshit, but like, that probably isn't like a bad investigative question if we could do the archaeology of like, is there a clear operation in how human sacrifice that changes when you have more military focus on like expansion and conquest? But like, I kind of don't know empirically what you could dig up.
So
like,
how do we know about the Mexica empires is actually the spread of Nahua as a lingua franca among non-Mexica indigenous? And if you're in Central America today, like there's basically 2 language groups that show up, and that's Nawa and Mexica. That's one group, and then there's Quiche Mayan in that group. But what is interesting about that is like a lot of the indigenous groups that speak Nawa, as opposed to like Zapotec or something, they didn't originally speak that. So like I can't say a lot of these. Like it's like THU something something something, a bunch of vowels, another bunch of T and H's and L's and a couple of X's. It may mean 5 or 6 different things, because whenever the Spanish encountered a sound they didn't have a thing for, they would add an X, and sometimes they're using the Nawa, which means it's like a CH, like Mexica, and sometimes it's like a hua, and sometimes sometimes it's a shill. I just bleh. So, you know, have fun with that. Mexican Spanish is hugely fun because of that particularity. But you know, we know that they grew from that, because we also know linguistically that the languages that are more related to Mayan are completely different than the Uto Nawa, Uto Aztecan language family. The other languages related to Nawa are all like the Ute, the Paiute, the Goshu, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, but what I was going to say that complicates that though, PH, is we also know that there were other societies not related to linguistic or culturally the Mexica that that did mass human sacrifice in Mesoamerica. The Teotihuacanos being the prime example, but also like Teotihuacano Mayan hybrid cultures like what you see at Chichen Itza. Those also did it. But early Maya don't seem to have done sacrifices. They did blood sacrifices and like ritual blood, but they didn't seem to like like kill people as much. And that develops later. And so we also don't know if the Nawa, I mean the Mexica, always did human sacrifice. Like I said, there's some speculation that they engaged in human sacrifice and cannibalistic practices in the Southwest priorly, but we don't know that those are the same groups of people. We just know that happened. Like we have evidence that somebody literally ate Anasazi, but we don't know who they were. Like, so yeah. And also, but you know, if he'd have known more, it'd have been interesting for him to contrast this with what we know of like the Morai and the Maori, like you know, like Oceania peoples and tribes. You know, I just keep on thinking like, man, you could have done a deeper dive and tried harder and done more comparisons, and maybe this would be more interesting to me. Whereas I'm reading this to be like, what wild shit are you going to claim off of relatively good advice?
Well, the next section is like where he just goes straight
wild bullshit
metal lyrics, like like it's probably my favorite section from just like a writing standpoint, because you're just like, all right, like you're just like spitting out like insane shit. Like,
let's talk about it. Are you from primacy of religion to primacy of marriage effectivist? That's only like. By the way, that whole thing we talked about is only 2 paragraphs. This is the other thing.
Yeah, that's the part that I just read.
Yeah, that's the other thing about Bataille is like we have only been through like 5 pages, guys.
Yeah, this is where it like, but yeah. Before we go to the next section, like that part that I just read, that's where it really does end with him basically being like, Aztec society becomes like entirely focused on sacrifice. Seems to be his like conclusion. He says like Aztecs like. The movement of violence that animated Aztec society was never turned more within than without, but internal and external violences combined in an economy that put nothing in reserve. The ritual sacrifices of prisoners commanded the sacrifices of warriors. The sacrificed victims represented at least the sumptuary expenditure of the sacrificer. The substituting of a prisoner for the king was an obvious, if inconsequent, abatement of this sacrificial frenzy. Like he really does seem to be building towards like, they never become a military society, but the militarization of their society that still retains a value of like sacrifice he does seem to be kind of going toward like their entire society just becomes like this sacrificial like engine in like a way.
I mean, if you believe everything in the various codexes that we have post Hispanic conquest, then you would believe that.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you know, and we tend to think that the Florentine Codex is the one that is the most trustworthy from what we can see from archaeology. That's the De Sagund one. But there's also there's the Codex. I can't even say this. Maglibiciano. That is Magliabeciano. Whew. And I'm not, and I also don't know if I'm supposed to pronounce that like Spanish or like Nawa. But like that's like actually the more salacious one, that if you believed it, like they were killing like thousands of people a day. Which frankly doesn't seem possible.
Yeah, the Warhammer 40K like vision of Aztec society where like, they're just feeding people to the Golden Throne like galaxies in.
Yeah, it's right. It's just, you know. So it's
I will say the anthropological record, what little do we have, does seem to suggest not like a massive uptick like that, but like a like steady uptick to the point where the Spanish could go to the people who had been conquested by the Mexica and convince them to rebel against them, right?
Oh yeah, it was not hard to get the subjugated tribes to side with the Spaniards at all.
Mm-hmm.
Which to me has always been interesting because you always hear this story and like, oh yeah, like 52 Spaniards can be defeated the entire Mexica Empire, and like these are people who could literally build a city on a fucking lake and like have perfect like advanced calendars and had really crazy sharp weapons and blah blah. And you're just like, there's no way that happened. And it wasn't that. They they were seen as relatively new conquerors in an empire that no one liked. And the Spaniards were able to play that off, and the Spaniards had swords that were better at actually killing people because they were designed to actually kill people, as opposed to those obsidian swords, which are designed to maim you to take you back to be sacrificed. So, but yeah, and it does seem like it increased a lot. One thing we do know now is like there are also cycles to like who, what, when, and how. So like there's the decapitation of women cycle, there's the flower war cycle, there's the sacrifice of children and captors of water to water deities, there is gladiatorial fighting cycles, there's a lot more than it does seem like. There was sacrifices to the fire gods by burning people alive. I don't know. I mean, like, even if it's not at the Warhammer 40K, there seems to be enough ways to get yourself killed arbitrarily in Mexica society that I would probably be on like, fuck it, we'll throw our lot in with the Spanish too. But it's settler versus settler action. So, and that's the other thing that people that I think he's completely missing. If you think about this, like this is also a terror regime from people who are outside conquerors, who are and that kind of makes sense. Like from the Marxist perspective, like if you read like Kautsky or even Lenin on like terror regimes, that's when the terror regimes are more likely to happen when you have a minority trying to rule a majority, because the only way to really do it is like mass excessive violence, which of course the Bataille would probably literally beat off to. So anyway, is that disparaging Bataille's character? Even because he probably want us to think
he would
that.
not.
I don't like.
He would not take it that way. No.
Because like I've been fascinated reading his biography and just been like, God, this guy's weirder than I even thought he was.
Yeah. Well, he has
Um,
he had that picture of like the death by 1,000 cuts torture that he just like
Yeah.
hung on his wall and would like stare at for like an hour a day. Like,
It was like he talks about that the way Mishima talks about watching Saint Sebastian. It's just bizarre. So whenever people think that we were all, that the internet made us perverts, no, we've been weird forever.
Yeah. Growing up with weird Catholic syphilitic fathers is enough.
There's something weirdly Catholic about all of it. Anyway,
Yeah, it's very really Catholic.
The Victim and the Sacred and the Cursed. I do want to read this because this is the last section, and then we can go on to the potlash section. The victim is a surplus taken from the mass of useful wealth, and he can only be withdrawn from it in order to be consumed profitlessly and therefore utterly destroyed. Again, though, that the reason why I brought up the stuff about cannibalism, even though I think a little bit of it that's naive, is it doesn't seem like the other destruction was completely profitlessly. Like they did use human remains for stuff. Once chosen, he is a cursed share. Haha! The title shows up. Destined for violent consumption. But the curse tears him away from the order of things. Title of Foucault book. It gives him a recognizable, which now radiates intimacy, anguish, and profundity of living beings. Nothing is more striking than the attention that is lavished on him. Being a thing, he can no longer be withdrawn from the real order, which binds him unless destruction rids him of his thinghood, eliminating his usefulness once and for all. As soon as he is consecrated, and during the time that he becomes consecrated in death, he enters the closeness of the sacrificers and participates in their consumption. He is one of their own, and in the festival in which he will perish, he sings, dances, and enjoys all the pleasure with them. Again, we have to take it that the propaganda sources are being honest there. There is no more civility in him, and he can even receive arms and fight. He is lost in the immense confusion of the festival, and that's precisely his undoing. The victim will only be, in fact, to leave the real order entirely, for he alone is carried along by the end of the movement of the festival. The sacrificer is divine only with reservation. The future is heavily reserved in him. The future is the weight of the bears the thing. The official theologians of whom tradition Sahagun collected were all aware of this, for they placed the voluntary sacrifice of the Nawatutzin above the others, praised warriors for being consumed by the gods, and gave divinity the meaning of their consumption. Okay, I just want to point out, though, that he's only talking about one of the kinds of sacrifices they do, which I find interesting, because we like this. A lot of this stuff doesn't apply to the sacrifices of captive children, slaves.
Well, there's like a sentence that he makes where after going through all of this, he goes like, and this was like one of the types of sacrifice, and then other people were just kind of like thrown away or whatever, and then he just like continues on with his line of thought. Like this is the only one that I want to really focus on is the
one that best fits my weird obsession and or so that's the sacrifice chapter.
I was going to just make a quick. We didn't really talk that much about the sacrifice or consumption section.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's before the final one.
Go ahead and do that.
That's the one where he gets all like poetic and shit and very like kind of semi-Heideggerian. I was just going to point out there's a couple things that I think we've seen a little bit that show up more. Like one, it was brought up like the Hegelian thing, and that this is where I think he has a very clear, almost like master-slave dialectic thing, but he's like kind of inverting it because he's talks about like, yes, it's he mentions the order of things a couple times, and he talks about like what he despises the most is making something into a thing. And he says that like labor makes things into things, like, whereas like he kind of seems to have this view of like there's a more kind of like natural like being in the world type vibe where like the thing before you just confronts you as this like part of the universe, this like object of its with all of its own kind of like noumenal power, and that labor and like this kind of like calculating thing reduces it into like a specific thing that you like act upon with like a specific purpose.
So Bataille is anti-Weber, basically. Yeah. Yeah.
He finds sacrifice interesting because he thinks that sacrifice has this weird element of like sacrifice always kind of has like utilitarian claims in a way. Like you often have a justification about why you're doing sacrifice. But he seems to think that like phenomenologically or something, the operation of sacrifice destroys the thingness about the thing, and it kind of forces you to confront this like it makes it like you're unable to like really relate to something in this kind of like operational way.
Right. And in this way, Bataille actually presages Foucault's weird, like almost celebration of royal cruelty as opposed to the rationalization of cruelty and in prisons and reform movement, where like you get the weird feeling that like Foucault actually thought it was better if you just rip people apart publicly.
He has this thing where he juxtaposes like intimacy and the real world.
Yeah.
And when he talks about the real world, he seems to mean like the world as made a thing by like people who are rationalistic, and like that like the modern world is called like the real world, but he is trying to be like, there's like he has like a quote where he says something like the introduction from the start, the introduction of labor into the world replaced intimacy, the depth of desire, and its free outbreaks with rational progression, where what matters is no longer the truth of the present moment, but rather the subsequent results of operations. The first labor established the world of things.
This is why you don't let poetic reactionaries ever read Marx.
Yeah.
Just don't allow it.
And this is where we also get the Foucauldian thing where he says, I submit that madness itself gives a rarefied idea of a free subject, unsubordinated to the real order, in quotes, and occupied only with the present. The subject leaves its own domain and subordinates itself to the objects of the real order as soon as it becomes concerned for the future. For the subject is consumption insofar as it is not tied down to work. If I am no longer concerned with what will be, but about what is, what reason do I have to keep anything in reserve? And then this leads to a sense of intimacy where he has the quote, consumption is the way which separate beings communicate.
All right. And so that was the section on Aztec human sacrifice. And then we move on to potlatch, which even though the potlatch section is arguably the most important section in this entire two books, or three books if you read it, volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, it's also like a remarkably small number of pages.
Yeah.
I'm continually surprised at how short a lot of these sections are.
Yeah, because you're just like, this could be a whole fucking 2 books. And we're not even to the most problematic stuff. The most problematic stuff is the stuff on Tibetan Buddhism and Islam, because that's like stuff that affects people that you might know and is more wrong. But this. I mean, I feel like this is like a 7-page gloss on Marcel Mauss's The Gift. But anyway, I will just read the first 2 sections here. Human sacrifice were only an extreme moment in the cycle of prodigitalities. That's a weird word. The passion that made the blood stream from the pyramids generally led the Aztec world to make unproductive use of substantial portions of resources it commanded. One of the functions of the sovereign, of the chief of men, who had an immense riches at his disposal, was to indulge in ostentatious squander. Which, to be fair, this isn't a lot more than Mexica society. Like potlatch stuff you find all over the world. Apparently, he himself was supposed to have been, in more ancient times, the culmination of the cycle of sacrifices. His immolation, consented to by the people he embodied, if not by him, could give the rising tide of killings the value of unlimited consumption. His power must have saved him in the end, but he was so clearly the man of prodigality that he gave his wealth in place of his life. He was obliged to give and to play. And long quote by Segund. I'm not going to read it. The sovereign was merely the richest, but everyone according to his worth and his image. The rich, the nobles, the merchants had to answer to the same expectation. Festivals were an outpouring not only of blood, but also of wealth in general. Each one contributed to the proportion to his power, and each one was made an offer to the occasion, a display of his power. Through capture and warfare, and through purchase, the warriors and the merchants obtained the victims of sacrifice. Mexicans built the stone temples established with divine statues, and the ritual service multiplied the expensive offerings. The officiants and victims were richly adorned, and the ritual feast entailed considerable expenditures. I think this is actually interesting, getting past the metal human sacrifice part of it, in that honor cultures, like literally the term honor is about being able to bestow wealth, usually useless wealth, in the form of some token as an honor of your relationship to the leader. And we like you see this in Homeric stuff, and the giving of rings and all that in Viking culture, et cetera, and that's a real thing. Like that's not something that just Bataille is pulling out of his ass. And I do find that interesting. So go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask a question whether Bataille was using wealth in the way that Bataille was defining wealth in the first two sections. Because I was like thrown a little bit there when there's describing wealth and the wealthy, and I was like, oh, I think Bataille is just using like the colloquial term at this point.
Yeah, I think he's using the wealth as in surplus. I think is pretty much all he means.
Yeah,
but well, I mean, I think he would still be like, but all of this comes from like energy of some sort. But I don't think he's like trying to be like physicsy about it. I think
Okay.
It's just like, yeah,
that would be too much science for Bataille. Remember, we're fundamentally against Weberian rationalization, even though he's never said that, but that's clearly one of the things he's against. All right, wealthy and ritual prodigality. What do we make of this section?
I don't know. I thought it was kind of interesting as a little bit about like, yes, there are merchants, but the merchants don't care about profit in the way that we think of profit today, which is one of those things that I'm like, he probably has some truth, but is also probably not engaging with other things that probably happened that are maybe a little closer to what we would think of as profit. Like
Marx might even agree with him because we're not dealing with abstractions of wealth yet through abstract labor.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not counting labor time as a form of like rationalizing production and generating profits that way. I mean, and that distinction leads to all kinds of weird shit, like when Graeber reads Confucian aristocrats as being anti-capitalist because they don't like merchants. Because Graeber doesn't recognize any difference in the value of like wealth extraction as physical surplus and wealth as abstract surplus. Bataille kind of does, but like Bataille seems fundamentally unable to be rigorous in his terms. like you know, it's which is Bataille also starts this goddamn trend in French theory of like reading Marx in technical terminology broadly so that we can talk about value in both the specific Marxian term and then like just general moral way that's confusing as fuck because it has nothing to do with what Marx was talking about exactly. Or only kind of does in a like Wittgensteinian family resemblances on crack sort of way.
I mean, it's definitely there in like the Deleuze-Guattari, like where like everything can plug into anything else in this like
we can describe
everything's a machine, everything's this like
like I know that the Deleuze and Guattari is like the hot stuff on the left that's not Marxist. But how do I say this nicely without pissing everyone off? I'm just gonna piss everyone off. I think Deleuze and Guattari is like this giant game of equivocation all the fucking time, and I hate it. Like when they like, and it gets picked up by people like communizers and stuff, where they're
Mhm.
like, we can talk about the MCM movement in general historical broad terms and not just specific to capitalism. And they're like, no, you fucking can't. That's a misapplication of technical term. Like, and so
they're the kind of people that even when I agree with them, I hate it because just the way that they talk about it annoys the hell. Even when they're like making a point that I'm like, yes, I agree with. Even in like the broad philosophical stuff, when they make things I agree with, I'm just like, yes, but I also, you're making me like this thing less.
Yes.
Because I'm having to agree with you about it. Like,
right. Like their theory of the rhizomatic social forms being less given to cascade failure, more resilient. I agree with, but the way they make the argument pisses me off.
Yeah.
Like, or what they're almost as bad as Umberto Eco, and they're like, everyone's a fascist, blah blah blah. Like, I don't even know what you fucking mean by fascism anymore. This is what
it's what's deep inside of your heart. That's what fascism is, right?
Umberto Eco, I'm like, makes more sense to me when I was thinking about like, oh well, he's like an Italian guy that lived through like the 70s. I kind of get why he was thinking this. Like,
right, he also isn't claiming fascism is actually fascism either, which is something that I should point out more. But anyway, yeah, like he was an Italian guy who lived long enough to make fun of Evola in a novel. If you guys don't know that, there's an Evola proxy in Foucault's Pendulum, and it's really fucking funny. But anyway, actually, people, if you want to learn about fascism from Umberto Eco, don't read the Fascism. Read the actual novel he wrote about it.
The Prague one?
No, well, that one too. No, the Foucault's Pendulum about like occult conspiracies and their tendency to go fascistic.
Yeah. I was thinking the Prague one, which is about like where he was just like, I'm going to make the most reactionary character.
Yeah, ever existed ever. That's also making fun of Evola.
Yeah.
There's a whole lot of Umberto Eco making fun of Julius Evola. But anyway. Okay. The potlatch of the are we? Wait, I'm skipping a section. Or am I? Because there's so few. There's so much in so few pages.
I had just brought up the thing that he says that like merchants in this time, even though they go and they trade goods, that he thinks that it's not really about profit. It's about like the glory of giving gifts from one like lord to another.
See, yeah, I think he is right in that it's not about profit in the way Marxist or bourgeois society sees profit.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he's wrong that it's just about giving gifts to the Lord.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of, no.
Like, I read that section and was like, is this like one paragraph, the entire like quarter of Dawn of Everything? Is like this one paragraph where all of this comes from?
Yes. Actually, no. Where this all comes from is Marcel Mauss's The Gift, and basically all of Graeber's career is trying to use Marcel Mauss to argue for his weird forms of voluntaristic communism that also has no history, and there's no physical limitations to human beings and no environmental inputs, and it's just about your proximity to environment sometimes.
I'm also curious. I'm just curious about in this, like, because he always puts like the merchant in quotes, where he's like, he's trying to be like the people that we would call merchants, but aren't like our conception of merchant. But I'm like, I'm not really sure. Like, I don't think he gives a specific word about like, is there an actual specific like role in Aztec society that he's claiming is this kind of person? Or is he just kind of saying like, yeah, there's people who go around and like engage in trade, which we would maybe think of like merchant work, but like, I'm not sure if he actually is saying like there's a class of people who are like merchant traders, or if he's just talking about like in general when people would go and give stuff in return as just part of being like a lord or something. You know, like it's one of those things that I don't even know if it's clear if he thinks that there's like an actual specific group of people.
Yeah, is he describing a class or is he just describing a thing that happens?
Yeah.
Right. I actually don't remember if there is a merchant class in Mexica society. I actually don't. I just can't remember if there is.
Because that's why I was thinking about, like, you mentioned, Varn, how, like, in a lot of, in the Western world, at least, in, like, a lot of, like, empires that get lots of territory and things, like, people who are, like, actual merchants, like, that run, like, trade houses and go place to place and stuff are often viewed kind of suspiciously.
Right, yeah. Merchants
Like-
are not trusted
there-
generally in most
there is a
antique
merchant
societies.
class in Aztec society, the Pochteka.
Okay.
Oh, the pot lashers?
Yeah, basically the potlatchers.
So 3 primary duties: market management, international trade, and then local intermediaries. So they would, I think they probably did go on those travels to like the.
Yeah, it says,
Oh.
professional long distance traveling merchants in the Aztec Empire.
but that thing that they're also basically like they're also basically governors from reading what you just said.
Yeah, they
and-
seem kind of like semi-administrative in a way.
Yeah, so they're like merchants / traveling bureaucrats. Not two things we normally think of together, but are both are disliked in most traditional societies.
Yeah, like, I mean, this is still Wikipedia, but like, it does sound like these people. It has a thing about like they often would bring stuff to lords to display their wealth, but it has a thing kind of saying like it sounds like these are basically people that go to conquered areas, take stuff, go to the noblemen, and be like, "Here's all the stuff that we got for you, like from your like holdings or like whatever kind of thing."
And then like, oh, we need some more chocolate. Let's trade some of this wealth for this other like wealth that we can't just take easily.
It says, because of their success, many of these merchants would become as wealthy as the noble class, but were obligated to hide their wealth from the public.
This is more so akin to like the tax collector in the Roman Empire than it is
Yeah,
to, like,
this
the
is
merchant
yeah,
class.
yeah. This is closer to the. Although I mean, you could
It's
argue that
semi-private. It sounds like, but yeah, like I think
so was
in
the
practice, what
tax
they were
collector
doing
in
is
the. Yeah, I mean, the tax collector in Roman society was privatized. Like how you supported yourself was tax farm, because you had to give a certain amount to the empire, but you got to keep what the excess if you could wring it out of people, which of course makes you the most hated person in goddamn society because like you're basically an eternal middleman. But yeah, I find that interesting. We would not call that position in medieval culture, in late antique culture. We wouldn't call them merchants. Actually, we would call them tax farmers.
Mm-hmm.
Like it sounds like, yeah, Bataille is probably wrong that they're like these people going around just like interested in like the glory of the Lord or something. Like they do seem to have some kind of like, not profit in the sense of like calculated economic like. But it sounds like they're these people going around and they're like, I can get really, really wealthy if I like take goods from the like conquered areas and whatnot and like provide them to the lords and also like trade information around.
Mm-hmm.
This is why I should read Wikipedia more. As much as I'm fascinated with Aztec culture, I'm always focused on like its settlerness. I actually don't know much about their internal class divisions, but there's a bunch of subclasses. So there's a class that is that specifically trades on behalf of the nobility. There's a class that traded as spies. There were warrior merchants. There were senior warrior merchants, or what was called merchant generals in English, and they were seen as a way to start trade, but as a precursor to military conquest specifically. Then there are the elders of the Pochteka, who are supposed to be general administrators who administrate the marketplace and tax farm. There are the first of the merchants, who are governors. There are merchant judges, and then there are merchant apprentices. So that does not sound, but only 2 of these things sound like what we mean by merchants at all.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it does look like it has some kind of like trade guild, like managing markets.
Yeah, there's a trade guild part of this,
Like,
but there's
Yeah.
also like a tax
Yeah.
farming part of this, and there's a also we're trading so we can take you over and sacrifice you later part of this.
Yeah.
So I mean,
will
I guess,
note
but
just
yeah,
but just I might, if anyone's like wants to delve more into like this particular part, I just noticed that in the Wikipedia, a lot of the citations come from one book by Kenneth G. Hirth called "The Aztec Economic World: Merchants and Markets in Ancient Mesoamerica." That's
And
from
to-
Cambridge University Press, 2016.
yeah, I was gonna say it's a relatively new book, so I guess so. This is probably something that Bataille couldn't have known. Like,
But yeah, the Amazon blurb says what makes the Aztec economy unique is that it developed one of the most sophisticated market economies in the ancient world in a society with one of the worst transportation systems.
yeah, there's no will.
Mhm.
Yeah,
That's
Well,
true for
it's
all.
not-
That's not just Go ahead.
Oh, it just says the Pope's check is in the Florentine Codex, which Bataille would have had access to.
Right,
it
but
was-
I don't think that the
trade.
stuff about
Yeah.
the stuff about the subclasses all seems to be from this one book that we were talking about. Like all of that seems to be from that. So he probably is fairly representing what was in the Florentine Codex.
yeah. I mean, it
But-
doesn't sound wrong. Like that, there were people that traded to lords basically to give them wealth. I think is like what he's taking away, which is probably
So him calling them merchants in question marks actually is probably accurate because they're not really merchants the way we think of them.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious if there was like an actual social role that was like clear, but like, yeah, it does. But it's probably
There
the
apparently
case that
is
social
multiple.
role was way more complex than Bataille understood, as is probably usually the case.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, wait till we get to the section on Tibetan Buddhism. I'm just going to tell you
Yeah.
because that's something I know a shit lot about, and he's wrong on a lot. But anyway, so theory. One of the things he says is it's an unarmed society, which is pretty fucking funny. But anyway, okay. So theory of the potlatch. So we basically get this transition to the potlatch Canadian spear. So yeah. I mean, we actually get something systematized here. Although I don't think this is his systematization. I think this may be who does he cite? He is citing Dumizel almost solely for this stuff.
Yeah, this entire section only has one
It's
endnote.
Dumizel and Marcel Mauss. That's
Yeah.
it. That's what you got. So
Yeah,
so
he just
very
says all of these
early-
facts are from the authoritative study by Marcel Mauss.
right, aka the one book I read. To be fair, this is Brandon is where you all this stuff like is this where Graeber got everything? Yes. Yes, it is.
It is becoming more and more clear. Yeah.
He got it all from Marcel Mauss and then Marshall Solons. That's the two sort. Like if you want to like the where Graeber gets his ideas from, it tends to be Marcel Mauss and Solons, including the hostility to biology. Although Graeber takes it further than Solons does. So yeah, cool. All right, potlatch. But we get because this is from Marcel Mauss, we actually get a systematized theory, and he bothers to give it to us. So I'm just going to read the systems. 1, the paradox of the gift reduced to the acquisition of power. 2, the apparent absurdity of gifts. 3, the acquisition of whites. This is what I was talking about with honor cultures and gift culture. 4, the first basic law, and there are. I will now read the first basic law. A surplus of resources which society has constantly at their disposal at certain points at certain times cannot be the object of a complete appropriation. It cannot be usefully employed. It cannot be employed for the growth of productive forces. But the squandering of the surplus itself becomes an object of appropriation. This supposedly is why we have status things and Velbin goods and stuff like that. What is appropriated in the squander is the prestige it gives the squanderer. This is Velbin goods again, so status goods, things that don't make sense that we waste a lot of resources on. And Marx doesn't account for. I mean, this is the thing that is often thrown at Marx, is Marx doesn't account for Velbin goods or status at all.
He does mention it briefly in Capital, like one paragraph where he says this is
Yeah, I got
possible.
some really brief stuff about it. But...
Yeah, it's not in there. I just was, but it's like so not what drives his economic thought. Conversely, rank in society can be appropriated in the same way as a tool or a field. Section 5, ambiguity and contradiction, or Rule 6. 6, luxury and extreme poverty. And then that's it. That's, but all those, this is all from Marcel Mauss. Like if you've read The Gift, this is where all this comes from. So, and The Gift is like, it's like with Levi Strauss, this is considered foundationally good anthropology, but flawed because it's so old, but not fundamentally wrong. Like, as opposed to like Fraser's The Golden Bough, which people now think is mostly, it's fun to read, but it's mostly bullshit. Or whatever Young was smoking. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So what do we? I mean, who doesn't know the theory of potlatch? Has anyone not encountered this before? Because I feel like this ironically is the most famous part of this book, even though it's the least unique to Bataille.
This is actually my first time running into this as well. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
I somehow miss things in my political ideological growth that are like blaringly right there, but I just like swerve right around and then encounter way later than I should have.
So interestingly, I did learn about the potlatch from Bataille because I was into, industrial music, and there was a whole special issue of Re/Search magazine that mentioned Bataille, and that's how I found out about this stuff. And then I read Marcel Mauss and got into anthropology. I read this like as a teenager, because Bataille was really edgy. Like Foucault, like that's for nerds. But like, Bataille talked about evil and shit. So, and so as a vaguely reactionary child, I kind of got into Bataille because it's also like sex and death. Woo, cool. 19th, early 20th century decadent literature theorized. Yay, fun. That kind of shit. It's like, let's read Bataille and decide. That's it's what you do, I guess. But yeah, potlatch is a theory of using surplus to prove your wealth because you have, to prove your power because you have the surplus wealth to do it. More or less. Like, yeah. And it's a way of maintaining class society in a way, in a pre-bourgeois context specifically.
Well, he has that cool line about like you enrich yourself in contempt for riches. Like you get to be like, I don't even need to care about this stuff. I can just give it to you, like kind of attitude, like. But it's not like utilitarian in the sense of like being like, I have to use all my wealth. It's like a sign of rank that you don't even need to think about it. Like,
yeah, this can be wasted. You can throw this.
Yeah. Like,
yeah. And
But
and this is not an anti-Marxist point, honestly, because like I said, Marx doesn't talk that much about this stuff. But like if you think about it, when Marx, although it's unclear to me if Marx is consistent if he thinks it's an illusion or not, because the separation of the political and the economic is sometimes taken as real in Marx and sometimes not. But where he talks about pre-bourgeois systems, there's no separation between the political and economic. This is part of what he's talking about. Like, and you know, it's also, if you grew up on like neoclassical economics, this seems cool because you're like, haha, it's not all about scarcity, is it, motherfucker? It's about other weirder shit. But you know, that's really liberating when you've been taught high school economics or early college economics. But once you've actually done political economy for a while, you're just like, oh, this shit's basic. Who actually believes that scarcity drives most markets? Like, nobody actually does.
Nobody, yeah.
Like,
People who took their high school economics class
and then stop there.
Yes.
Like, you took financial literacy and quit. Because the moment you start thinking about like artificial scarcity and then status goods that are not really all that scarce, you start getting into like, oh yeah, this is like when you realize that it's really easy to make diamonds. That like cubic zirconia and diamonds are chemically the exact same fucking thing. They aren't really different things. Like, it's just one you find in nature and one you make by hyper compressing coal, like quickly. But anyway, potlatch, cool. Read Marcel. I mean, I do think the second half of this short chapter is like, just read Marcel's Mouse as a gift, and you'll be fine.
I think
like,
the main maybe unique take that Bataille injects is that he has a weird because he has this weird like Nietzschean thing about like rank is like this paradoxical thing.
It's an ambiguity and paradox chapter. That
because you have to waste your resources without like a utilitarian end for it to be like a proper like show of sovereignty. But rank itself is like if you are trying to get rank, you are trying to have like a sort of like end for yourself for your waste. And he thinks that this is like he what is he like like you put the truth of life and blah blah blah. This calls for what cannot be grasped, the useless employment of oneself, of one's possessions for play, but it attempts to grasp that which it wished to be ungraspable, to use that whose utility is denied. It is not enough for our left hand to not know what the right hand gives. Clumsily, it tries to take it back. Rank is entirely the effect of this crooked will. In a sense, rank is the opposite of a thing. What founds it is sacred, and the general ordering of ranks is given the name of a hierarchy. It is the stubborn determination to treat as disposable and usable thing that whose essence is sacred, that which is completely removed from the profane utilitarian sphere, where the hand, unscrupulously and for servile ends, raises the hammer and nails the timber. But ambiguity encumbers the profane operation, just as it empties desire's vehemence at its meaning and changes it into an apparent comedy. So he has this kind of like weird thing of like he likes the like give and take element, but he thinks that the like focus on rank is this kind of weirdly like problematic. Like there's like this weird ambiguity of like, yeah, you're trying to do the sacred giving away, but you're not really sacrificing things because you are trying to utilitize it for your own rank and ends, which establishes hierarchy, which he doesn't really like.
Yeah,
this is parallel streams, so like they're not exactly crossing at all, but this is the same like contradiction of like T.H. Mill saying that like the ultra rich need to give away their riches because that's what's morally due to them, but by doing that they also reify being the ultra rich and everything. Like this is like the fundamental problem, like progressive liberal theory as well.
You get to Mill, and then the answer to that from Adorno is like, you know, the paradox of this is that you're justifying the system that makes it so. And I mean, fair enough. Although, as an observation, like almost all critical theorists who've ever like kind of touched Hegel a little bit have seen this, and even some people who haven't touched Hegel but still have some kind of dialectical frameworks end up at this. So it's like the basic you know, it's like it is actually similar to the master slave dialectic, whereas the slave is actually the one driving the dialectic and blah 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 blah. But it's way more edgy. I mean, like when reading Bataille, I often feel like we're dealing with like normal European philosophical uses of anthropology, but way edgier. You don't have a solar anus, and Bataille does. Like,
yeah, that feels fair.
Yeah, but I was just looking at I was thinking about the rank thing, because the ending of the chapter is where he has this bit where he's like, he says that potlatch is like, potlatch reveals like the meaningful form of luxury, but he also kind of says like modern rank, even though it still has principles in this, has like a new level of like calculatedness that like ruins the ruination of like the giving in and of itself. Like he like you've spoiled the meaning of like actually giving up excess for like the moment or whatever, because it's all still like this like future oriented kind of like thing. And you get this part where he says like, the true luxury and the real potlatch of our times falls to the poverty-stricken. That is, to the individual who lies down and scoffs. A genuine luxury requires the complete contempt for riches, the somber indifference of the individual who works, who refuses work and makes his life on the one hand an infinitely ruined splendor, and on the other a silent insult to the laborious lie of the rich.
This is back to chapter 1 where he tries to say that like we like all society has this surplus, and it's actually like trying to like grab this surplus and like use it instead of wasting it is actually the problem of like modernity, right?
Yeah. Well, like it's good to like use it in the like in the moment like sensuous like experience of like wealth and things, but it's not good to like use it in the sense of like productively building towards something he doesn't really like. Like it's that sort of like
so this
future oriented versus like just like doing stuff now for me because I like it, like kind of thing.
Use value versus abstract value. To put it in Marxist terms. But like
very much.
Like it seems like the central bad thing for, I wouldn't say sin because Bataille likes sin. The central bad thing for Bataille, read the biography. The central bad thing for Bataille is reification. In social systems that don't reify because of their even extreme excessive and irrational violence, it's better. Because fuck Weber, I guess. I mean, I don't think that Bataille's not responding directly to Weber. He's responding directly to like Weberian ideas in general society. But like,
he's responding to like post 50s Fordism in France, like basically, or the rhetoric of what people were saying it was going to be.
Yeah, he wants his fin de siècle back. God damn it. Which reading this kind of stuff makes me like, you guys had no idea how you like. Well, the big problem of Fordism is that it was boring. You have no idea what was going to happen when you got rid of it. But I mean, I do mean that like very specifically, like in late Foucault, he starts flirting with neoliberalism explicitly because it's anti-Fordist, and then kind of drops it right before he dies. But like, whereas like a lot of like productive forces Marxism actually ends up being basically Fordism, but run by the state explicitly. So
it'll be interesting when we get to his section on the USSR. And like,
that's gonna be fun.
Soviet stuff tied into this.
I'm gonna be whipping out my Alex Nove economic history of the USSR, just to do some brief remembering.
So I have Hirsch's book on the Aztec economy here, and I went to the chapter on merchants, and I thought this was interesting. But in pre-Columbian thinking, merchants were all those individuals who worked to gain a profit through buying and or selling. The category included more than just commercial middlemen. It included a broad array of small-scale and part-time merchandisers who made things in their homes for sale in the marketplace. Small-scale commercial activity was an important component of the domestic economy.
So like cottage industry,
So-
like production.
So
Yeah.
merchants are everything from tax farmers to the petite bourgeois to household goods production.
To the peasantry too, right?
Yeah, the
Yeah.
peasantry would be.
Well,
yeah.
So it's counterposed to those to like, that's sort of stuff you do to top off your like local farming for income. But also Hirsch notes though that the big merchants, there was like a considerable amount of risk in their job because they would get like ambushed on their travels.
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone wanted to kill him. Like,
Yeah. And you're carrying all your like wealth that you have to bring around with you, probably
on your
Or, like,
back on the big right
Yeah.
roads. Those roads are fascinating. Having spent time in Mesoamerica, like in the Mayan version, where you're like they had these big lime roads that you just walked on at night, and we know they knew what round stuff was. Like, so the prohibition, and that's not just an Aztec prohibition. It's like it's a prohibition in Mesoamerica and multiple societies against wheels is fascinating to me. Just like, why? Like, why are wheels bad? Like, they had a circular calendar. They had to figure it out. So like,
they just had too many incidents of things rolling downhill really fast. They were like, we can't keep having this happen.
Because these roads also, like, one thing you have to get about these Mesoamerican economic roads, for example, is they're elevated. You're walking on these white line things that you can see on at night that are above the ground. Like, they're significantly off the ground. It's not like Roman roads. Like, they're more like walls almost.
It's like an aqueduct that you like walk on, sort of thing. Like,
yeah, walk on. Yeah, with big heavy shit strapped to your back. Like, which also makes it very hard to fight if you're ambushed. So yeah, everything about the Mesoamerica fascinates shit out of me because it really kind of doesn't make sense. Also, like all the head manipulation and skull stuff, I get why people thought that they maybe were aliens or something, because like if you look at the shaping of skulls, you're just like, that doesn't look like a person.
Flatten the forehead and stuff. Yeah.
The conical, like, you could cone head social status, literally, like, because you did molding of baby skulls. I just get fascinated by it. It does seem my Orientalism is probably Mesoamerica is a Orientalism. Just like, I'm just like what? Why did this happen? But yeah, and I could see how if you want to be like, take this, Weberian rationalizers, how do you explain this society, huh? But the thing is, like, you kind of can though.
Yeah.
I mean, throughout all of this, we were making connections to like Vikings. You could make some connections to southern Spain. Yeah.
I mean, well, this is the thing where, like, I'm also like, I could just pull out the Rene Girard and talk about all the societies that had human sacrifice. Like,
honestly, you could pull out like Ibn Khaldun and just kind of like work through some stuff.
Yeah, you can do all kinds of stuff with this. It makes me wish we were reading this book. Makes me wish we were reading Stone Age Economics by Marshall Solins and this Aztec Economic World book by Hirth, which I also just found as we were talking about it, because I'm like, this book sounds fucking fascinating. I need to read this.
Yeah.
It, and what is it? The fifth? What's that new book? It's the history of the Aztec. It was the fifth something.
Oh yeah, I have this. I have this written down actually.
It's the other book. It's the new book on Aztec history that I'm going to read them both, and I kind of wish I'd read these books instead of.
No, that's just the legend. Yeah, Fifth Son, New History of the Aztecs. Yeah,
that one.
Camilla Townsend.
The Aztec Economic World. Yeah, it's just like every now I'm like, I want to read stuff that's about this, but like not edgy, crazy French guy who's like. To be fair, though, I think one thing we can take away is he is not careless with facts. He's wild in interpretations. But he actually is not being careless with facts. He's not like making shit up. He's interpreting shit up. And I guess that is kind of a different thing. Because he keeps on telling us the meaning of things, and I'm like, you're pulling that meaning out your ass.
Yeah.
But he's
I would
not
argue
like
what he's doing
making
is
up
better
facts
than a
about
lot of.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'd argue that what he's doing is better than a lot of French philosophy.
Well,
yeah, that's what's weird about Bataille is like he's as if not more insane than like a lot of the people that come after him that have like actual like academic careers that like claim influence. Like,
but he's more careful.
Kristeva or like Deleuze and
Foucault.
But like I just like everyone who gets into I had my like big post-structuralist theory period when I was in like undergrad and stuff, and like the whole appeal is everyone being like, well, it's they're cool and they like make up words and like they don't care about your boring facts and like normal ideas. It's about like all this crazy shit. But Bataille is like just way more interesting and like doesn't do all the like he still has florid writing, but he doesn't do all the like obnoxious bullshit actually that much. Like it's so weird to me that I'm like, this guy is actually way more interesting to me than most of these other people that claim influence that are supposedly like
he's
all,
readable
like,
in English.
Yeah, like
well, I don't mean to be all super structural or anything, but I do think we have to blame the Académie France for a lot, because you can't import foreign words; you have to make them up. And I think Bourdieu is correct. Bourdieu, as in Pierre Bourdieu, not Badiou, as in Elaine. But Bourdieu is correct that it leads to this weird, like, word cultural casse marketing that he calls academic terrorism. That you see in late 20th century French stuff, but you actually don't see it in early 20th century French stuff. Like, and Bataille's interesting because he's florid, but it's because he's a weird, poetic, visionary, reactionary, crazy person. It's not because he's inventing new words. Like,
yeah. And like, I remember reading, there's an article, I think a New Left Review article by Peter Dews, where he's like one of those Marxists that's always like trying to engage with post-structuralism and like kind of discredit it, but he's better than most of the people that do that. He's not just like making polemics. He's trying to like actually engage with like the philosophical tradition, and like a lot of what his points are like actually all these things that these people are like talking about with contradictions you can find in like earlier like thinking usually. But he has a thing where he says something about that, like in the New Left Review article, that he likes Bataille and Blanchot more than their like subsequent people that claim them, because they just they just read like people that lived through a world war, and like a lot of it is just that they're like, it's like dark poetic writing because they're just like, what is the condition of humanity? They're not just like, I'm a fuck around like because I'm an academic, like that's kind of the charm of it, is like he feels like an actual like torn up guy who's just like trying to figure shit out in a very real way to me, like even though his conclusions are so like bizarre.
Well, I mean, to me that's interesting. He reminds me, and he's sort of an intermediary period between like Tristan Tzara and the pre-situationalists like Dadaists and stuff, a lot of whom ended up in weird positions or fascists, but were actually really working through weird shit. They were not just academics.
I mean, he was thrown out by Andre Breton and
right, exactly,
stuff, like,
and like the surrealist and all that. Like that early, that like post fin de siècle but post-structuralist period French thought is messy. It's very messy. But it's pretty interesting, because they're responding to, and like those people went in weird directions. A lot of them became like reactionary Catholics. A couple became fascists. A couple became Marxists. A lot of them became surrealists. And Bataille feels closer to those guys, than to Deleuze but since he's dealing with the same thinkers that the later post-structuralists are, he also kind of reads like an in-between figure. And also since he's trying to like tie it into Marxism in some way, but also he's not part of like the French ultra left or the French Marxist Leninist left. He's his own, although he was a Marxist Leninist for a little while, apparently, like for like 35 seconds or something. Bataille, Van Jones, Jin Kwan, Robert Reich. No, yeah, it's I don't I as much as I'm giving this book shit because I actually love reading Bataille, because I find him to be interesting factually, and his interpretations are batshit, but they're like productively batshit. When I try to think through them, I'm like, okay, well, even proving this wrong, I'm going to actually learn something.
Bataille,
whereas
Bataille honestly reminds. Oh,
go ahead.
Oh, Bataille reminds me of Sartre that way, where it's like Bataille's the most interesting when he's wrong, because you get to like go off in these like random tangents and just like, again, like literally just today, like finding this random book by Hurt and being like, I'm gonna read this book this week now.
Yeah, we're gonna have to get. I think we're gonna get really into it when we get to the stuff on Lamaism and Islam, which is our next section, which we are taking a brief break so you guys know. Blah blah blah, medical reasons if you're following the show, and I don't release things in order, so people might not know that. But we should be coming back as long as things possible, probably late January or early February. So we're just, also, you guys can enjoy your holidays, and we'll come back to this. This probably won't be released till January, so by the time this gets out to the public, it's already like we already might have reconvened. It depends on what happens with my biopsy, but so we are taking a break. The listeners, I don't know when you're going to get this. You might not notice that much of a break because I don't release these all the time anyway. They come out about every 6 weeks. We're going to try to get them out monthly next year, but we're not hitting that yet for a variety of reasons. And you guys should read some Bataille. It's literary theoretical crack, I think. Because it's also addictive. Like, I was really in my 20s, I was really into Bataille. Like, I would just like read the Sex and Death book and the eroticism book and this stuff.
I have a big collection of his stuff that I don't have in my apartment now, but I've got the big Assophal like secret society book that they have that has like all the stuff that they had internally. It's a good read.
You can't see this. I have a whole shelf of Bataille.
Yeah, and there's a new book actually that the French list from Seagull Books, like the one that does like the Italian list and whatever. French list is doing like a new release of like all of the collected papers of like Bataille basically, or like critical essays of Bataille. So you can go and buy like volume 1 now, and it has like all the stuff. It has like a bunch of the stuff that was collected in like Literature and Evil and stuff. Like it has a bunch of stuff that's scattered all over now. Like normally, it's like all.
I have it right here. I think actually right here.
Yeah,
critical essays 1, 44 to 48. You used to have to like you get them in Literature and Evil, which I have over here too.
Yeah,
you get it in not that one.
Visions of Excess and
Visions of Excess, which is a wild book.
That's awesome. It's an awesome book.
Do you think Accursed shares fucking way? Accursed share at least has a theme. Like
Visions of Excess has like an essay about the big toe and like
Bataille also like Accursed share will lead you to believe that he's more systematic than he is. Like also he writes the weirdest fucking literature. Like I read Story of an Eye when I was 20 and I was like, this is insane. erotic literature about disembodied body parts. It's just like not something I was think I was gonna deal with.
Yeah.
So there's a reason why I suggested we cover Bataille, because it's just fun.
I remember.
But go ahead.
What I was just gonna say, one of my favorite anecdotes about how he's such a weirdo is like, I remember reading Blue of Noon, which is like his unfinished, like semi-autobiographical novel that has a character that's supposed to be Simone Weil, because he like met up with her a couple times, like the Christian mystic who like went and was in the Spanish Civil War and was a pacifist and like stuff. And like there's like records of like she was in her little like commie circle, like commie anarchist circle, and he would like go and hang out with them. And like basically every account is like they would just get into a big argument about like whether good is good or evil is good. And then like Simone Weil would just be like, why do we hang out with this guy? Like, he's insane and just says gross shit all the time. Like, and I'm like, I can't possibly imagine sitting next to two different, like, more disparate people.
There's a book about that called Saints of the Impossible that I need to read now, because I'm like, Simone Weil is like, I mean, whenever you meet someone who's like, you meet the cool Catholic who's into Simone Weil and Dorothy Day and like in kind of like communism isn't all that bad, liberation theology, and then you just imagine like them hanging out with Bataille, who's like an art school Satanist.
It's like that. It's a meme. It's like the meme where it's like, "Hi, I'm like Simone Weil," and you're like, "Who's that behind you?" And they're like, "Don't look at that guy. Don't recognize me."
We don't talk about him.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
I need to check this book out now. Saints.
I've also added that book.
I'm totally fascinated with. I mean, this period and like the period and when like Lenin's in exile, I'm like, what is that like Lenin and like a Zara and somebody else is all in a cafe. Like it's just like. Europe was actually a relatively small place, I guess, in the early 20th century.
Well, it is like there's that like quote that gets shared around every once in a while of the guy being like, people don't understand how you could just like go places in a real way. Like you could just get on a boat and like go somewhere, like, and
in a very real sense, the internet has actually like made the world bigger.
I mean, obviously, if you were like wealthy enough and probably not like black, but I mean, you could probably get around too if you were poor and black, but you probably weren't going to have a great time. But like in a real sense, the conditions of like what international travel was so different. Like even if it was less efficient, technically, like
but you'd be hanging out on a boat with all kinds of random people.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, like we're just stuck on a boat for 3 months. What the fuck else we're gonna do but talk about weird shit? I don't know. like I almost did do like one vacation I had, because when I was in Korea we'd have these long winter breaks, right? Like very long, like 3 months, and I would do research, but also usually go back to America. That's when I like did my whole Occupy tour thing. Thank you, Platypus Affiliated Society, et cetera. But one of the years I wanted to just do this whole early 20th century thing of just getting on the fucking Orient Express and going from Vladivostok to St. Petersburg, and then I talked myself out of it because being stuck on a train for that long. But we have to remember that was all travel, right? Like, and yeah, I don't know. It's weird to me to think about that, or like Castro hanging out with Hemingway. It's just also like the people who, when you were saying like the internet made the world bigger, it did. It also made us less willing to like accidentally run into people or have to deal with things. Like
totally.
So it's
unless you're in Varn vlog, and then
unless you're in Varn vlog, and then
you're always dealing with things.
They're all just weird.
Ty doesn't like things. So.
It's usually me ranting about something. But yeah, I am. I'm getting a kick out of reading this, even though I'm shit talking it, because it's also interesting. Like I would actually defend Bataille more than Foucault in that Bataille is actually like factually somewhat grounded. At least he's basing it like it's only like he's not using that many studies. He's not doing cross comparisons. It's kind of intellectually sloppy. And at the same time, he's also not making shit up or using comparisons to hide stuff. And he is kind of showing his work. Like you can be like, well, that's a wild interpretation of that, but at least I know where you got it from. Yeah. Like
he'll say, I'm using one source for all this. Like
yeah.
he'll just be like,
I read a book once.
Coming from one thing. Like I just realized
I really like this Marcel Mouse book.
Yeah. But I'm gonna have to pop out because I just realized how.
All right, let's head out, guys. Thank you so much. We're done. All right.
Yeah, we're just bullshitting.
And on that note, we shall end.
See y'all.